Hi, I'm Katrin McCoy with Tier 1 Performance. My pronouns are she or they, and you're listening to In Conversation with David Rivera, PhD, National Advisor to the STEVE Fund. If you haven't heard of this yet, the STEVE Fund is the nation's leading organization that is focusing on supporting the mental health and emotional well-being of young people of color, specifically students, by working with colleges and universities, nonprofits, researchers, mental health experts, and young people with their families. The STEVE Fund is doing the important work of promoting programs and strategies that build not only understanding for the mental and emotional health of students of color, but also, and perhaps more critically, they're actually building assistance and support for those students to have mental and emotional health. So I am honored to be in conversation today with Dr. David P. Rivera. He is an associate professor of counselor education at Queens College, which is a senior college of the City University of New York. David is also a national advisor to the STEVE Fund. He received his doctorate in counseling psychology from Columbia University. David also holds degrees in psychology and counseling from Johns Hopkins University and the University of Wyoming. David also is a published researcher and author on microaggression theory and cultural competency development, as well as issues impacting the marginalization and well-being of people of color and oppressed sexual orientation and gender identity groups. David, welcome. It is my pleasure to be speaking with you today.
Katrin, thank you so much for having me here to share about my work, but also the wonderful things that the STEVE Fund has been engaged in over the past 7 or so years since we've been around.
Yeah, it has been a powerful 7 years just in seeing the impact you all have been able to make already. So again, we are just so honored to have you here. And yeah, let's get into this conversation. First, for anyone listening at home who may not be familiar with the STEVE Fund and what all you are doing, I would love for us to talk first just a little bit about what the research shows today. Specifically, I want to know, how are students of color currently being impacted by the academic systems they're acting within? What are the major symptoms, so to say, that we're seeing or that the research is showing that these students of color are experiencing and having to navigate?
Yeah, great questions. I like to kind of ground ourselves kind of in how colleges and universities study themselves in terms of campus climate. I know many have been motivated given the events over the past year and a half, the heightened awareness that we have of racial disparities that have kind of shown through via the pandemic that were previously existing. But what often universities are doing, they're wanting to understand how inclusive is our campus? Do students feel as if they belong here? Right, that's an important question. This issue of belonging, right? I kind of think about it in terms of, if you were to go over somebody's house, right, and want to use the restroom, if you just met them for the first time, you probably would ask, "Where's the bathroom at? Where's something to drink," or what have you. If they were close friends or family, you would know immediately where to go because you feel welcomed and invited. So you might just go to the bathroom on your own accord. You might just head to the kitchen to grab yourself a glass of water. I think about the same in terms of our students on campus, on our college campuses. By and large, we're finding that students of color are not feeling as if they belong. They're not feeling that sense of ownership that should come with inclusion, right? I think what we're learning is that to include somebody doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to feel as if they belong. And so what we find, and this was before the pandemic, and the statistics have probably gotten a bit more harsh post-pandemic or during it actually, is that by and large, BIPOC students, so Black, Indigenous students of color, felt that they were more, that their campuses were less inclusive than white students, right? About 28% of BIPOC students would actually report that their campuses were inclusive compared to 45% of white students, right? And then the result of that is that we find that students of color are finding themselves isolated on their college campuses, either because they're not finding mirrors of themselves or folks that look like them on campus, or they might be isolating as a protective function, right, to kind of preclude themselves from instances of bias and microaggression, et cetera. And so I kind of think about those two statistics first, right? So how are students feeling included and are they isolating, right? Students are isolating We know that in general, people that isolate tend to report more issues of mental health compromises, right? And that's what we don't want to happen. So let's kind of go into the pandemic. The Healthy Mind study revealed that Black and Latinx students in particular were less likely to view their professors as sources of support during the pandemic, which is pretty startling to me as a professor, as somebody who knows that I was oftentimes the only point of contact that my students had during the pandemic. If they weren't seeing me as somebody who was supportive, that's pretty troubling. When we think about experiences of racial discrimination, Asian students reported that they were more likely to experience direct instances of racial discrimination compared to any other race of students. And then we think about witnessing it. Asian students also reported higher rates of witnessing discrimination compared to any other race of student, right? And it's not really difficult to kind of connect the dots in terms of why Asian and Pacific Islander students in particular were experiencing it and witnessing it more, right? The pandemic started out with immense negative rhetoric about the pandemic related to China, right? And related to Asia. And that translated directly into how Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders experienced themselves as racialized beings in the United States pre-pandemic, but also during the pandemic, those things were exacerbated. When we think about all students, so all students of color as an aggregate experienced witnessing discrimination at higher rates than white students. And additionally, white students were more likely to agree that Asians were respected in the broader society compared to Asian and Latinx students. And so we're seeing a disconnect here in terms of how white students are perceiving their peers, right? They're not perceiving them quite accurately, right? And when we think about what our students are experiencing on college campuses, it's just a microcosm of what people experience in everyday life. And so we know that people that are just navigating this world outside of higher ed are still having these same kinds of experiences. We also saw in terms of in specific mental health issues that early on in the pandemic, we saw a drastic rise in depression and anxiety symptoms compared to pre-pandemic years. And we know that overall, regardless of a student of color is an undergraduate, a graduate, a professional student, that they're reporting higher rates of depression and anxiety compared to their white peers, right? And so we see overall, students of color are not feeling as included on their campuses, they're feeling more isolated, and they're reporting higher rates of mental health compromises compared to their white peers.
Right, which is, I mean, hearing those statistics you just shared, and thank you, for sharing with us some of that research. When I sit and reflect with those numbers, it just makes crystal clear to me a phrase that I've heard you share many a time in our earlier conversations. It just makes clear to me that for this work to be successful, we got to really embody that mindset of it takes a village in order to get not just individuals feeling better in their individual situations, but really fixing it from a systemic point of view so that all the different parts and players within that system are also, accounted for and owning up their own impact that they're having on students of color. So, I'm just reflecting on how important it is that we embody that principle of it takes a village, but I'm also reflecting on that is a different ism than ones that I grew up with. So I'm, a racialized white person living in the Midwest. A phrase I heard very often as a kid was pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. Can you talk a little bit about how the mindset of it takes a village, what does that require of us as individuals? And then when we talk about our systems, what does that require of us to make that whole systemic village work in concert to support students of color versus perhaps, I think you would argue, and I would say too, directly oppressing them?
Yeah, this is a really important area to tease apart because we're talking about some of the main ideals and norms that have been really in a secure place in this country since, before even the 1700s, right? This rugged sense of individualism that permeates our society. This phrase, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, comes from that rugged sense of individualism. The false ideas or the myth of meritocracy, right? The idea, right? There's a belief that we live in a meritocratic society, right? Where merit by itself will be the determination in terms of how one is able to achieve and optimize their fullest potentials. And we know that that is false, right? We'll also say that we live in an egalitarian society, right? But we know that is false. We know that people are born with different sets of privileges and different sets of oppressions that really do dictate how they are going to navigate different systems in our society, right? And so this is really important to kind of think about what are the kind of these main norms that guide the United States in terms of its functioning across systems and institutions. How are they currently still alive? And how are they working against us, right? It takes a village is more of a collectivistic stance, right? It means that we need to think about ourselves above and beyond how I might be functioning, right? Just because I'm flourishing and I have no mental health issues that are preventing me from succeeding in life, right? Doesn't mean that somebody else is suffering, right? And so really removing ourselves from ourselves, right? To kind of see the bigger picture, to understand mental health and wellness as a basic need is really important in this idea as well. When we think about our institutions of higher education, for example, for all too often, this work of wellness has lived within a specific office, or maybe a couple offices on campus. So the counseling center, maybe the dean of students office, right? But oftentimes these issues are dealt with in a quote unquote remedial way, where somebody is already presenting with a compromise and now we're providing them with therapy or possibly a medication to help them kind of get through that issue or work through that issue. What we need to do is think about prevention, right? And that means that everybody has a hand to play in this. When we think about education in particular, the end goal is academic success. The end goal is getting our students to graduate. Every single person that works within an educational institution, regardless of what your title or role is, right? If you are the groundskeeper, if you are the one who prepares the meals, if you are the one who keeps our facilities clean, right? If you're the one who is advising students on their career development, if you're the one that's teaching them in the classroom, or if you're the one who's calling the major shots as a president or provost, every single one of those people has a role in helping our students to successfully navigate that institution. And we have to see every single person as a major player and in terms of optimizing the wellness of our students so that they can get to that endpoint of graduation and so that they can optimize their fullest potentials.
Oh, absolutely. There's every time we talk about potential and achieving potential and someone reaching their potential, which is language we use a lot at Tier 1 performance as well, when we're just thinking about how the things we're building and designing will help employees or companies reach their full potential. It always brings me back to the needs of people, because we're talking about people when we discuss potential for the most part here. We definitely are. But people have needs. We are not automatons. We're not robots. We have very complex set of needs. So it always makes me think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which, if you're not familiar with it, it's that pyramid where at the bottom you have those basic needs of, having a safe place to lay your head at night, having some food, enough for the day, those sorts of needs. To your point, David, I think, and Tier 1 would agree with this, that mental health is a basic need for people, just as physical health. It's all part of the body. It's all health. But there's this relationship between where you're at on that hierarchy of needs and having your needs met and your ability to actually do and achieve and produce. So it just seems to me that we have created this impossible math equation where, to your point, we're focusing on the end wrong result of students of color having mental health issues and treating those issues. And what I'm hearing you say is what we should be doing is fixing the equation so we don't even get to that point in the word problem. We have a different outcome. So this is a big question, but how do we fix that equation? And maybe you can share with us some of the ways that the STEE Fund is partnering with organizations to start changing some of those formulas so we get different outcomes for students of color.
Definitely, yeah. So what do we need to do, right? Like the equation obviously isn't working, right? So it means we need a new equation, right? Maybe we even need a new framework. Maybe it's not even a mathematical metaphor that we're using. Maybe it's something else, right? The system is so broken, right? And I want to say it's broken for those that it's not working for. It's been working for those in privileged positions since its creation because that's who it was created for, right? We need to take a historical perspective and an ecological perspective. And that's something that the STEE Fund has done since our inception, right? We take a community stance, right? And so we think not only about individuals, but we think about the institutions that individuals are embedded in and how those institutions influence the individual. We think about the communities that our institutions are embedded in and think about how those communities impact the institution. And then we think about the larger system, right? The larger social system that we all find ourselves living in and how, the politics that are embedded there, the rhetoric even around the politics, even if a law doesn't go into or something doesn't go into law, the rhetoric or just the talking, whatever that is spoken about it can actually do some harm or good, right? Depending on the nature of it. But then we're all embedded in the historical context. And for all too long, we often take a ahistorical perspective where we don't think about the history of higher ed to understand that it's really only been in the last 50 years or so that higher ed has started and has become more integrated. Before then, it was mostly, white men from privilege that were kind of in most of our higher ed institutions, right? And so little by little, it became integrated because of gender, because of race and ethnicity, because of ability status, because of socioeconomic status, right? And we're still kind of building in more inclusiveness in terms of who we're allowing, but it's really important to position ourselves, understanding that we're still quite new in terms of this game or what we're doing to kind of change the system or to address these issues. The other thing that we need to kind of hold as a truth is that the reality of racism is that it was intentionally built into the system, right, as a mechanism of control. We cannot think of racism or acts of racism via microaggression or what have you as isolated chance events. No, these things are going to happen. If we have a system that was created on racism and racist ideologies, then obviously we're going to find manifestations of racism via bias occur, right? And so we can't think that this is chance, right? And so if we can kind of accept some of these as givens, then we can start to then create kind of a new equation, if you will, for what to do. If we can start to think about our institutions as the ones that need to be redesigned, right? As opposed to trying to redesign students, which is what we've been trying to do all too long. We've been trying to force students to fit into the system that wasn't created for them. Right? It's like trying to fit in, kind of a square peg in a round circle, if you will, right? That doesn't work. The shapes were not made for each other, right? And so we got to redesign the system such that it is more affirming and more validating of students of color. And by that means by all marginalized students. And that means we need to interrogate the structures, right? That we have taken for granted for all too long, right? Starting with, how does this university even promote itself, right? Is it promoting itself fairly and realistically to students of color? What are we doing once we admit students, right, on our campuses? What systems are in place for their success, right? Are they built into all the systems or do they have to go to a special office, right? If they have to go to a special office, that means that the work has not quite yet been institutionalized. I want to reach a point, my dream is that we don't have an office of multicultural affairs. We don't have to have an office of ability support services because those services are a given, right? It's not an extra thing. When we think about even how ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, has been translated onto college campuses, it's not been translated in terms of what the intent was. The intent was that we need to change the system such that students with disabilities are able to live their lives and their academic and personal lives with ease, right? Where they don't have to go seek an additional support or accommodations, right? So that an instructor now has to think of a different way of teaching or offering services. And so we got to flip the code here such that the institutions are ill, right? The students were well to begin with, and our institutions just actually make them a bit sicker, right, than they actually were when they first stepped foot on campus. But if we position the institution as ill, then that's who we need to remediate. That's who we need to redesign, right? And we can use the voices of students and their experiences to help inform that. But we need to kind of change that. Otherwise, we're going to be stuck in this remediation framework, which isn't helping anyone.
I couldn't agree more. And I have, just as we think about the students who are currently in that situation of, let's call it remediation, if we would like to use that word, because I don't want to lose sight of them, right? Because they are the reality of the outcomes of our system. So it is doubly important that we also support them. To your point, they have struggled and survived and come through, and so it's up to us to help them on their own journeys. So I would love to hear just a little bit, just to share with those who are listening at home, just some ways that the Steve Fund is working with partners to do that work of helping students of color feel that they belong, feel safe, feel supported, feel like they are in that position of being able to learn, which is the whole point of them making that investment to go to college in the first place. So how is the Steve Fund helping colleges and universities to live up to their own value proposition to students of color? And also, how are you helping to dispel that myth for students of color who feel that they are alone in this, so we can help them see that that's not the case?
Yeah, Katrin, perfect question. So similarly, to the ecological perspective and the community perspective that the Steve Fund has taken as a value from the very beginning is an inter-industry way of working, right? We know that, we're focused on college students to begin with, but college students don't come to us without any previous experiences, and they don't leave higher education into a vacuum of nothingness, right? They go somewhere, right? They come from somewhere and they go somewhere. And so the Steve Fund has, from the beginning, has drawn on partnerships with pre-college programs, with nonprofits and community-based organizations and schools, right? K through 12 schools, knowing that we need to start that work early, right? If we can influence these systems early on to support students as they need to, right? To give students of color what they need to flourish, then when they enter into college, they're going to have some more things going for them, right? Even if that college system is still broken, at least these students might enter in with some skills for coping, right? Some critical consciousness raising about systems of oppression, about systemic racism, about microaggressions and how they manifest, about imposter phenomenon and stereotype threat. Again, phenomenon that have been studied empirically for quite some time, but we can give that knowledge to young people so that they're prepared for what to expect, right? As we're working to redesign the system. And then we also know that, our universities and colleges haven't been the best in terms of launching students into the world of work, right? Especially our marginalized students and our students of color, right? And so we've also partnered with the world of work and the world of employment, corporations, Morgan Stanley, Zoom, Peloton, Harry's. Many organizations are so invested that they are giving the Steve Fund grants to kind of work on these issues so that they can know what are the best practices that employers should be engaged in, knowing that they are having employees of color enter into their environments and their workspaces that are coming with racial trauma, right, from their past. And so giving people the language of racial trauma and what we can do to combat that, right? There's this racism recovery plan that the Steve Fund commonly preaches. If anybody listening just Googles Boston College racism recovery plan, you'll get this knowledge led up by Dr. Janet Helms. Amazing, and it's valuable for any person of color, regardless of age. But the Steve Fund has made these partnerships within higher ed as well, partnering with some of the top organizations in higher ed, the American Council on Education, NASPA, the Hispanic Scholarship Fund, Gates, et cetera. So folks that are out there doing this work. So we know it's through partnerships that we have strength. Again, collectivism. The more brilliant minds that we have, the more people that have access to influence in various areas, the stronger we're going to be. And so we've taken that and we've held that close to us. During the pandemic, one of our proudest pieces of work is the COVID Crisis Response Task Force report that I had the pleasure of sitting on. But this task force was, again, one of a kind. We had members of higher ed, we had corporate partners, we had partners from foundations, from nonprofits, from a variety of settings that came together to work on this issue of what can we do to support students during this pandemic context. We came up with 5 recommendations for all industries to kind of take to heart that were very critical and very practical in terms of providing guidance for what to do. And so that's one example of our inter-industry, I want to say, approach to this work, and how necessary it is to break the isolated silos that we often find ourselves living in. So even just talking to other institutions, right, of higher education, so that we can share our learnings and so that we can refine them, so that we can also keep each other accountable, right? There's many reasons for taking this kind of approach that are only going to lead to developing programs and projects and systems that are just going to be more beneficial, so that we can really get to that goal of optimizing the fullest potentials of young people of color.
Yes, yes, and yes. I have one more kind of a big question for you. And it really flows rather, I should say, really nicely from what you were just saying about that it takes a village and that we are all in this together collectively. So it is so clear after talking with you that as individuals, whether we are students or working professionals, whether we're in academia or not, none of us can let microaggressions slide, because we know the impact that students of color will feel. And hey, I would argue people of color, right? It's not just our students, it's all people of color. But we are seeing how you've shared, the research shows it greases the wheels of the system of oppression. So instead, we need to learn how to interact with microaggressions overtly. So what I want to know is, can we break down how that looks from the perspective of a person who maybe they have indeed let microaggressions slide in the past? You know, I'm thinking of someone like me, again, a racialized white person. I'm on my own individual journey. I'm unlearning racist assumptions because I was born in the United States. So that's where I'm at. So I have learned, and I'm still learning, and would love to share with people who have listened and are still listening. Can we give them a playbook, you know, in that moment of need, when it matters, when the microaggression occurs? How do we break through someone's barriers to help them? Again, putting on my tier 1 consultant hat, how do we activate this for people so that they can do it and not just listen, but be part of the journey as well?
Mm-hmm. Great question. And one of the most common questions that I hear when I talk about microaggressions to anyone, regardless of who they are, if it's just passing by, talk on, you know, while I'm commuting or if I'm giving a lecture, is what do we do? And I want everyone to kind of hold in their mind, and we know this saying because it was used previously during disasters, but we can continue. If you see something, say something. Right? If you see something, say something. With microaggressions and the way that the reason why they are called microaggressions is not because they're small or they have little impact. They're called microaggressions. That term micro just means that they're commonly occurring. They occur all the time. And all the studies that I've either been a part of or that I have reviewed have shown that the more microaggressions one experiences in their life, regardless of context, if it's from education, from the world of work, from community, or even from one's own kind of family, that the more microaggressions one experiences, the worse their outcomes are, right? Across outcomes. So wellness, mental health, employment, educational attainment, et cetera. So we know that they lead to real life compromises and issues. So if we see something, say something, right? And that say something part is probably what people are wondering. Well, what do I say? Quite frankly, say anything, right? We're at a point to where we just need to express some kind of disagreement. We're rarely going to know, especially once we are at the beginning, once we are starting to say something, rarely are we going to know fully what is the best thing to say. But I will say, saying something and expressing some kind of disagreement is the very least that we can do. We know how to do that. We even know how to express disagreement non-verbally, which is often what I recommend, right? Furrowing the brow, crossing one's arms. That is our nonverbal way of saying something isn't quite right here, right? And so there's actually a 4-step model, and there are more recommendations. So my mentor at Teachers College, Columbia University, Daryl Wing Su, and his current students came out with a framework that was published in the American Psychologist in January of 2019 on a micro intervention that we can use. And it was a 4-step model that they were proposing that anybody could use, regardless of your background. You can be an observer, so maybe you're experiencing this vicariously, or you can be directly involved. But the first step is to make the invisible visible. That's kind of like if you see something, say something. Again, microaggressions often run under the radar of our awareness, so we need to bring it to our attention, right? First, we need to just reveal this is what's going on. So even just saying, oh, that sounds like a microaggression to me, right? That terminology is kind of becoming mainstream terminology, so we could just say what it is, right? And if someone's like, oh, what is a microaggression? Well, now is our opportunity to educate what a microaggression happens to be, right? And so make that invisible communication visible by expressing some kind of disagreement, by stating that maybe this is a microaggression that's going on. The next step is disarming the microaggression, right? Through more intentional disagreement. And so again, crossing one's arms, using nonverbal communication. Nonverbal communication is about 85% of all of our communication. And so it's very powerful. Sometimes people don't have the words to say, or they're kind of self-forming. Well, what would I say? Well, use your nonverbal communication. Shake your head no even, right? Express something to express disagreement so that that person or the people involved understand. So this isn't just for the benefit of the person who is the aggressor, but this is also support for the people who are being aggressed in the situation. So the one that's receiving the microaggression. The third step is to educate the offender in some way, shape, or form. Oftentimes, the conversation is going to be held up on this intent versus impact. People often reply with, well, that wasn't my intention. And people often think that that's enough to kind of resolve somebody from any implications or any of their doings with that event. And my response is, I don't really care about intention. The law has punishments for unintentional causes of murder. We call that manslaughter, right? And so we should be using the same kind of framework in everyday life, because that's a framework for law. I don't really borrow a lot from the law, but that's one of the frameworks that I borrow from the law in terms of how we should deal with microaggressions. Even though it was unintentional, you didn't mean it, let's focus on the impact. And so I want to have an impact conversation, right? And so we share. Even as an observer, I was harmed, right? That didn't make me feel so good. No, I had to take a step back. My heart rate even went up, right? And so I'm having some physiological reactions. So really break down what that impact was like, either as the observer or if you're the direct recipient, and have an impact conversation as opposed to an intent conversation. And the last step is to seek some kind of external intervention or support, or if there's a reporting system, to actually report it. We have to start reporting these issues. Right? In our institutions, many institutions of higher education already have incident reports, bias incident report systems in place. We can include microaggressions there. If there isn't a system of reporting bias in place, we can create systems, right? That's the joy of being a human being. We can create things, right? We're working within a system where everything was created. That means we can create other things, right? And so we should think about some way of reporting it. But also seeking out support, right? So go to your networks, your personal networks of people that are like-minded, that understand you as a person, especially if you're the one receiving the microaggression. You know, on my phone, I have a number of chats on here. One is for support when I endure a microaggression. You know, I have people that I just send a text to get that support from. But having some kind of external intervention or support could be helpful, either that personal support or some way of reporting it. But again, when it comes down to it, if you see something, say something. Also give yourself some kind of leeway in terms of approaching this, knowing that there isn't going to be, you know, a 100% foolproof method of engaging with these issues. Oftentimes, you know, maybe the result is just that we brought it to the attention of somebody, right? Maybe they didn't know what microaggressions were, and we're starting there. Right? Maybe they knew what they were, and now we're having a deeper conversation, right? But also to give ourselves, you know, some benefit of the doubt in this endeavor to correct these wrongs, but just to know that we need to be voicing some kind of disagreement, and at the very least, that's what we can do, right? Through these experiences of navigating them, we'll develop more words, right? More language for intervening, and we'll learn along the way. But this is a learning process for all of us. And I even share that with people when I'm doing these. You know, I'm guilty of microaggressions. I have many privileged identities, such as being a man, a cisgender man. And so gender microaggressions are very frequent for me because I'm socialized into this country with the sexism that's also socialized into this country, right? So to give ourselves, you know, a little bit of care, right, and compassion and self-compassion, but to know that we need to do something. We need to step up, right? And we can't let discomfort interfere or serve as the major boundary, because it's going to be uncomfortable. So expect it to be uncomfortable, but to know that good will come out of it, right? If it's just for one person or if it's just for ourselves, right? That expressing this disagreement, helping to disarm these microaggressions are some of the steps that we need to do as a collective, right? To address these things so that they are not harming people in the way that they're harming people now.
Exactly. Yes. I loved how you spoke earlier about the need to decenter ourselves and our intentions when we're having these conversations, and to instead center the impacts that others are feeling and how we are all working and impacting together in this. I mean, this has just been such an inspiring conversation to have. So thank you, David, so much. I know we could keep talking, and I know we've only got so much time together, but I just want to thank you and the Steve Fund so much for all the work you're doing. It is truly an honor to be able to help tell your story, and hopefully we've convinced some people to go learn a bit more about the Steve Fund. I will say thank you again to everyone who's listening. If you would like to learn more about the Steve Fund or about Dr. David Rivera, you can check out the Showcase tab of the XLearn virtual portal and find the Steve Fund. We will have links to their website and a couple more resources that we discussed today. We'll also include some links in case you're looking to learn more about microaggressions, or maybe you want to check out that 4-step framework. But David, again, just thank you so much. Anything else you'd like to share before we call it a close to this wonderful conversation?
I just want to thank you and your colleagues for really elevating this issue to a place of prominence where it needs to be. And again, a lot of this is just by having conversation and dialogue. So I encourage everyone out there to make mental health a priority in your life, especially with your loved ones, to be checking in on a regular basis, asking how you are or how are you, and really waiting for a meaningful answer as opposed to just using it as a proxy for hello, right? These small steps can lead to great actions and can lead to societal norming that is definitely needed. We all have a part to play. Beautiful. Couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you, David. Have a good one. Thank you all for listening.